Honor your father and mother is the bridge commandment. You've got love the Lord your God. The first 5 relate to God. The second 5 relate to yourself and your neighbors. The middle one bridges the 2. Honor your father and mother. Your parents are your first God-given authority. Mm-hmm. It really is the bridge commandment. It connects them together. So honor your father and your mother is one of the most important commandments. Parents are God's first authority in our lives. Satan's most effective plan is to usurp this authority. He does this with the birth certificate. We don't recognize it. We just do things without realizing what he's doing. This is called passing your seed through the fire to Moloch. I'm going to get to that. Passing your seed through the fire to Moloch. Seed represents children. That's pretty clear. We don't need to explain that anymore. Moloch is a ruler or a god. It's the Hebrew word Molech, which is Molech, that is a king, the chief deity of the Ammonites, comes from Malach, which means it's the king. The word means king. Yes. Another way to say this would be passing your seed through the fire to the king. Through the fire is a euphemism for contract. Burnt offerings are covenant or contract offerings. Every time you see a covenant made, there's a burnt offering, like Noah's burnt offering. The covenant with Abram, he did a burnt offering. Remember, he passed through the fire. He cut the offerings up. The burnt offering is the only offering that's cut in pieces. By the time it got to the tabernacle, you cut it in pieces and you ratify the contract. It's passing your seed through the fire is what it is. When God made a covenant with Israel, did a burnt offering. This is a covenant offering. It's always been that. The Abrahamic covenant is the best example. God ratified when he passed between the sacrifices. He cut them up, just like all burnt offerings are cut, and then he walked through them. This was a custom used in making and confirming covenants. A calf or some other creature were cut in pieces, and the parts laid in order, and the covenantees passed between these parts, signifying thereby that if they did not fulfill the engagements they entered into, they imprecated to be cut to pieces as that creature was. So by the time we get to the tabernacle, the burnt offering that was cut, if you think about when the Bible talks about make a covenant, the word make is cut. You cut a covenant. And you think about just how this word traces. You cut a deal, you cut a covenant, you slice your hand and you do a blood handshake. We've been doing this stuff since the burnt offering for thousands of years. It's been tweaked and manipulated a little bit, but every time a burnt offering, they were ratifying a covenant. Just as God passed through the sacrifices to ratify a covenant, so passing your seed through the fire ratifies a covenant. It's a form of idolatry named Molech, and this was the manner of its worship, that one would hand over one's child to the pagan priests who would make 2 huge fires. The child was then passed through on foot. They walked through the fire. Were they burning to death? No. It is generally assumed that the child went through unscathed. We want to think passing your seed through the fire and child sacrifice are the same thing. They're totally different. Rabbi Maimonides agrees that the children were not harmed when he said it was a light thing. It's a light thing, like signing a birth certificate. Sure, just send it over here. I'll sign it real quick. We treat it the same way today. Jephthah's vow that whatsoever comes forth of the doors of my house to meet me, I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Was he really going to do that? This is why Jephthah's vow was not child sacrifice. His daughter was dedicated in covenant to God, which means his daughter was leaving him to serve God. Which is why she said, let this thing be done for me. Is she saying, Dad, please slit my throat and bleed me on the altar and burn me? Is that what she's saying? No. No, she's bewailing her virginity. She's not going to get married. She's going to the temple to work. It's a sad day. He didn't want to do that to his daughter, but he's not killing her. He's not killing her. He's passing his seed through the fire, making a covenant with his child. He didn't want to do that. This is what we call the doctrine of parens patriae today. Latin for parent of his or her country, the power of the state to act as guardian for those who are unable to care for themselves, such as children or disabled individuals. For example, under this doctrine, a judge may change custody, child support, or other rulings affecting a child's well-being, regardless of what the parents may have agreed to. The parents are no longer the authority once you get a birth certificate, which is why CPS has authority. You don't get a birth certificate, they have no authority. And you can read all about that in the courts. The first thing they ask when you're doing child, do you have a birth certificate? They just do it all formally. Oh yeah, can we get your social security, marriage license, and birth certificate? They act like it's a formality, but if you go in there and say, I don't have a social security card, marriage license, or birth certificate, oh, wait a second. Now you got to prove to us why you have authority. But the birth certificate is an adhesion contract. It's a standard form contract drafted by one party, usually a business with stronger bargaining power, and signed by the weaker party, usually a consumer in need of goods or services, who must adhere to the contract and therefore does not have the power to negotiate or modify the terms of the contract. It's any god or ruler or big entity signing a contract with little old us. It's an adhesion contract. I can't change my credit card contract. They won't, oh, I don't like this one, or that one. They're not going to go for that. Those are adhesion contracts. Parents patres is the same thing. By the common law, parental rights were vested in the father. The modern tendency, however, is towards the equalization of the rights of the father and mother. This is evidenced by the adoption of statutes. They're referring to parents patres in the birth certificate. In many jurisdictions, making them father and mother joint guardians over their children. Guardians can have different levels. The state's the head guardian. They're in charge of the parents. That's where CPS gets all of its jurisdiction. If you don't have the birth certificate, CPS will not bother you. I mean, unless you're just like murdering your child or something, but there you're breaking the common law. So you're under a different law. That's all this is. So the conclusion, getting a birth certificate for your child is what the Bible calls passing your seed through the fire to Moloch. It's not child sacrifice. There was child sacrifice, which we're going over in a minute. But that was not it. And 99.9% of all America does it. And then we just, oh yeah, of course CPS has jurisdiction. But we didn't get birth certificates a couple hundred years ago. It was in our family Bible. So the remedy for this, there is no remedy to the birth certificate. When you give your kid to the state, they are not obligated to give them back, and you can't get them back. Vows. The scripture says we are to keep the vows we make, no matter how dumb they are. You keep the vow you make. Jephthah, he kept his vow. Not fun. We made a foolish vow. You got to keep it. That's what following God's law is, to keep it. There are solutions though, and I'm going to get to this more later. I forgot this part of the slide was in there, but I'm going to touch on this more later. There's a solution. Follow the agreement you made and you will not have problems. There are ways of escape. This is the word for loophole. That's exactly, there's a way of escape, and God's left us several of them. The way of escape with your kids is to homeschool, and their public school system won't corrupt them. You could teach them your values, and when they're 18, they can rescind their social security and their birth certificate. You can't rescind it for them. You gave it away. But when they're 18, because they didn't do it, they can undo it.
They can undo their birth certificate?
Yes, they can. Absolutely. But you as a parent can't do it on their behalf because you gave it away. But because they were a minor, they didn't have capacity to do that. It's the doctrine of latches. They need to, when they come across this information, act on it quickly and deal with it. So if you have kids that are under 18, they can still undo it. And as an adult, you can still undo it.